Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope you guys are doing great. So we are doing a series of talks based on a comment by Dr. Jordan Peterson where he mentioned that the ultimate purpose of life is what? Making peace, which of course I wholeheartedly disagree with for many good reasons.
Is there an ultimate purpose of life?
Yeah, sure.
What is it?
What we're doing here.
Which is what?
Hopefully trying to make peace.
Is that enough?
Now, to create a peaceful society, there are some challenges that we have to face, which we have been discussing over the last couple of episodes. And I discussed some of the theological problems that if you want to create a peaceful society, what are the theological challenges you have to face? We discussed some of those things in the last two episodes. And in this episode, we are solely focusing on the notion of democracy. And as we will be discussing this notion, there can be instances where you may find a little bit of disconnect. And that is because there are some theological aspect of this democracy. The notion of democracy has some theological aspect which we covered in episode number 2. I will put a link in the description. So if you find some disconnect, as we go through this discussion, if you face some disconnect, that is because some of the ideas are actually left off in that episode. Now, if that is the case, then I highly recommend that you listen to that episode first before moving to this one. Alrighty. So in this episode, we are dealing with democracy. All the major components of democracy will be analyzed, and at the end of this discussion, you will see as to why I firmly oppose the notion of democracy. Now, first of all, let's talk about the origin of democracy. That where does democracy originate? First of all, see, democracy originated in Judeo-Christian philosophy. Okay. And to be precise, men are created in the image of God. I'm talking about men and women. Okay. So whenever I refer to man, I'm not referring to man just for the sake of man. I'm referring to both genders. Okay. So man is created in the image of God. This is precisely where democracy is coming from. See, this statement is absolutely false. God does not have an image. Man portrayed God in his image. But this statement is believable. Man is created in the image of God. This statement is believable. And when you have a believable statement, guess what you can do? You can draw another conclusion out of that absolute falsehood. Because men are created in the image of God, that means all men must be equal. First statement is believable. If X, then Y. Simple logic. Because men are created in the image of God, and that's why all men must be equal. This is the origin of democracy. As I see it, correct me if I am wrong, but this is one of the fundamental principles of democracy. This is one of the fundamental principles where the notion of equality is coming from. Okay. And this equality, first of all, it is not supported by nature. It is not supported by nature. However, man has concocted this idea. Because see, nature does not support equality. Why? Because nature is about evolution. Nature is about change. Every moment of your life, you are changing. Every moment of your life, you will change. Like never was a time in your life you didn't change, and never will be a time in your life when you will not change. This change is the fundamental element of nature. What is change ultimately? Change means evolution. So, nature does not support equality. Nature supports evolution. So, when you force equality, you go against nature. And that's the fallacy. But this fallacy is rooted in Abrahamic philosophies. And precisely in that statement that men are created in the image of God. And this notion of equality is probably one of the worst form of tyrannical forces that we still have in our society. And as long as these notions exist within our society, the question is how much bloodshed will happen in future. We discussed some of those things in the previous episodes. And in the previous episodes, we discussed that how this notion of equality have been the catalyst for the slaughter, for the genocide of hundreds of millions of people. How this notion of equality has given birth to religious fanaticism, Abrahamic philosophies. Not only that these kind of political doctrines exist today in the form of, let's say, religion, also in the form of some political ideology itself. Let's say, for instance, communism, financial equality. So we analyzed some of the flaws of this equality in the previous episodes, but I'm going to refer them a little bit over here so that you can find a little bit of a connection. See, what is democracy? Democracy is cultural communism. All cultures are equal, but they are not equal. Again, we discussed some of the reasons as to why they are not equal. So the obvious question is why man has concocted this idea. To understand, we have to talk a little bit about psychology. Okay. So why have we concocted this idea that, oh, look, everything is equal? Because again, it is all coming from system one, representativeness. Like, let me give you a little bit of a background that how have I become interested in religion. Now, I read a book like long time ago. I'm talking about almost a decade. And that book was written by a very famous psychologist. His name is Dr. Danial Kahneman. The book is Thinking Fast and Slow. Okay. So one of these fundamental idea about this book is illusion. That your idea, these are all faulty. That's like one of the key ideas from key takeaways from that book. In no uncertain terms, like at the preface, the author said this: you are blind to the obvious and you are blind to your own blindness. You are blind to the obvious and you are blind to your own blindness. Like he was talking about a gorilla experiment, that there was two groups of players who were passing, like a ball was given to them who were, passing the ball between them and the spectators. Like it was a laboratory experiment, so they wanted the people who were participant in that experiment to count the passes. As they were counting the passes, a gorilla comes into the ground, thumbs into the chest and stays there for about 10 minutes, and guess what? Half of the participants didn't even realize, didn't even notice that there was a gorilla in that experiment, like half of the participant. So the author made a very, very, very significant remark out of this experiment, that you are blind to the obvious and you are blind to your own blindness. And this book then went on talking many scenarios, that how people make mistakes, like how all the biases that come along when we are taking decision, like how these ideas are utterly faulty, utterly wrong in many cases. Illusion, memory illusion, visual illusion, cognitive illusion, like he talked a whole bunch of different things. So why the equality? Why do we have to talk about equality? Because these are representativeness. These are biases. This is not reality. This is a feel-good emotion. Equality doesn't exist in nature, but you have to concoct this idea because it makes you feel good. To find the distinction between two objects, you have to work, you have to use your brain. But people, we are lazy people, we don't want to use our brain. That's why we go with the flow. And again, if you have to go against the flow, it's a very difficult task. Why you want to do that? Instead, you go with the flow. That's how the notion of equality, because it sounds so good, saying that, oh, look, these two are not equal, then you have to justify why they are not equal. It's a difficult job. Instead, you fall back to the easier one, mental substitution. Again, many of these ideas you will see in that book as well, like the notion of substitution that I just mentioned. You answer an easier question, not the question that you are asked. You replace it with an easier question. It's called mental shotgun substitution. System 1. System 1 means it's an intuitive response. It's not a thought out response. It's not a response that has logic behind it. It's just an intuitive response. It's a feel-good response. So in the last episode, we talked about how people, ignorant people, taking up the scripture in the name of God, committed the most egregious, the most depraved, the most sadistic human nature, the most sadistic behavior that a human being can display in the name of God. And all of these things came out of the notion of equality. Was the Indian philosophers wrong? That's my question. I would like to ask this question every single Christian who is listening to this. Was the Indian philosophers wrong, or are you wrong? After 7th of October, you are seeing protests after protests after protests after protest all over the world. Why are they protesting? Because in democracy, good equals to bad. Cultural communism. You decided that both of these cultures are equal. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's a call for genocide. But guess what? In the democratic society, that's freedom. We will talk about free speech in a minute, but let's talk about equality first. Because of this equality, not only whatever happened in the past happened in the past, but the question is what will happen in future. When there is a disease, what do? You root out the disease. But because democracy implies equality, what exactly are you doing? You're allowing that disease to spread. Is that a good idea? Look at what is happening in Bangladesh right now. Hindus are being butchered. Because they are Hindus, they are being butchered. Hundreds of people. They have been raped, they have been molested, their lands have been looted. Hundreds of people have been lynched on the street in many cases. Their house have been set on fire. It's difficult to take account of so many of these incidents. And this is not the first time that this has happened. It has a history of this kind of violence. Look at Middle East. What is happening to the Christians in Middle East? They are being butchered. You may not know about it. In Africa, look at what is happening in Africa. I'm talking about the Christians. They are not Hindus. I'm talking about Christians. I'm not talking about 2023 Jews. I'm not talking about 2014 Yazidis. I'm not talking about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or anything. Right now, as I speak, are they equal? The savages who are doing these things, whether it's in Middle East or Bangladesh or Africa, do you think they are equal? Honestly, under democracy, you gave them the freedom that chanting, mourning, praising terrorist is democracy. Without this equality, these people would not be chanting on the street. They wouldn't be given visas after supporting Hamas. Now you live in a democracy, that's why they are granted visas without vetting. Thousands, without any vetting whatsoever. Now, let's say that particularly the Muslim community, they have so many wives, they have so many children, and every vote counts as equal. There are changes that are occurring in the society, let's say for instance in UK, many of the constituencies have been outnumbered, like the native population have been outnumbered because of the high birth rate of the Muslim population. So there are some rapid changes that are taking place in the society because of this notion of equality. As we have seen over the last couple of years, like how the left-wing politics have come to the power. They capitalized on the vote bank policies. These things have been the reason for decline in many parts of the West, in many of the democracies. And this has happened precisely because of the notion of equality. See, what is democracy? Democracy has become basically a numbers game. One of the most obvious flaws of this equality is that democracy has become a weapon, is that it allows deceitful people, con men, who can emotionally manipulate people, because it's all about how many votes that you can gain. If you are good at manipulating people, if you know how to touch the emotional pain points of the population, you can gain their trust. And as you gain their trust, you can be elected into holding the political office. It has been weaponized by the left-wing politicians. Nowadays, we have a big discussion about mass migration, like what is left-wing politics? It is the politics of vote bank. If you have a vote base, you can stay in power. Democracy is about numbers game. The more votes that you have, the higher chances that you will have to stay in power. And that is why historically we have seen a lot of left-wing politics is based upon mass migration. Okay, people are coming from overseas, they are given citizenship, and they are given citizenship with an intention that they will vote for the left-wing politicians so that they can stay in power. So how do you think this is going to end? Do you think it is gonna be a big huggy kissy big party, community cohesion in a society where all cultures will be living next door to each other? They will all be celebrating diversity. Do you honestly believe that every culture will be celebrating diversity in the Western world? Now look, you may be right that there may not be a nuclear war. I don't think so, because that's the end of civilization, like that's the end of humanity. So most likely that people will not resort to a nuclear war. But guess what? There will be civil war. It's not a question of why. The why is equality, aka democracy. That is why. It's not a question of why, it's a question of when this civil war will take place. That's the question. Correct me if I am wrong. Like, do you honestly believe when you are seeing that people are chanting on the street, they're praising, they're mourning the death of the terrorist every single day, somewhere in the world, do you honestly believe that this is going to end up in a celebration of diversity? And who is to blame if that does happen? If there is a civil war takes place, who else is to blame other than this idea of democracy, this idea of equality? If not democracy, what else is supposed to be blamed for this? My worst fear is that how many, like in case of communism, we have seen like at least 100 million people have been slaughtered. In case of democracy, how many hundreds of millions of people have to be slaughtered this time? That's the question. And I think you are intelligent enough to figure it out on your own. That's about equality. Let's move on to the next item. Secularism. What is secularism? Separation of the church and state. Again, let's go back to the book by Dr. Danial Kahneman. One of the idea that I came across from that book and that really changed me is the idea of association. Banana and vomit. Banana and vomit. What happened to you just now when you heard the word banana? You became excited. There was a longing. There was a feeling of happiness because you enjoy eating a banana. But when I mentioned the word vomit, you may not realize it, but some part of your body, it kind of tensed up. You had a repulsive reaction, withdrawal. What are the most visceral reactions? Fight or flight, approach or retreat. When I uttered the word vomit, you had that retreat. You had that retreat. You had that withdrawal, flight response. These are completely out of your control. You may know about it, you may not know about it, but this is exactly how mind works. Mind works with association. Think about a pebble. You throw a pebble in the pond, what happens? There is a ripple that reaches to the shore eventually. So when I said vomit, your whole body responded. There was a ripple. Your whole body, whether it's in your face or whether it's in your toes, some parts of your body responded viscerally because of that pebble, because of that idea that I just brought to your mind. Any idea for that matter. That's how mind works. So what significance does it has with the notion of secularism, with the notion of the separation of church and state? Like, first of all, why did you needed the separation of church and state? Because of free speech, like free speech and secularism, like these ideas are coupled. These ideas are inseparable, like one cannot exist without the other. When you had the church and state together, there was no free speech. Burning of the witches, like Copernicus, the earth moves around the sun or something, when he said he was burned. That was the reason that you had to separate the state from the church. That you cannot live like this. You needed free speech, you needed free thinking. That is why you had to separate the church from the state. One cannot exist without the other. If there is no free speech, you don't need secularism. No free speech means church and state are coupled, they are together. But if you want free speech, if you want free thinking, then you need secularism. You have to separate the church from the state. Like, there is no alternative. So, what is the significance of this separation of the church and state? Like, what is the drawback? The drawback is this: void. Think about a garden. What happens if you cannot grow flower in a garden? Weeds is going to take over. If you cannot grow flower, guess what is going to take over the flower? Weeds. Nature doesn't like void. You separated the church. Fair enough. But guess what came along? Queers for Palestine. What came along? 52 pronouns. Some of the most absurd people that you happen to come across today, where are they coming from? They are coming from this idea. Because you separated the church and state, you created the void, and something else is now filling that void. It's all about association. This separation of church and state, it has created some of the most absurd humanity. This is not an Eastern idea. There was no church and state in India. Where are the temples coming from? Like, what is the notion of a temple? Like, who gave the notion of temple? Of course, Indians. Of course, the Bharatiyas. Why? Temple at the most basic understanding of temple is holiness. It's a holy place. There is a statue, there is a deity. It's a holy place. It's clean, there are incense. Like if you haven't gone to a temple, I highly recommend that you do. Okay? You cannot even take the shoes inside. The Vedi, the statue is placed in a podium. It's all about veneration, holiness. You are supposed to look up to that divinity. You are trying to become that ultimate. We talked about in the last episode, we talked about divine vision, that behold my hundreds and thousands of wonderful forms, that these are all divinity. Not only that it is about respect, like if you treat a cow as a divine entity, it's about respect. But guess what? There is much more grave, much more sophisticated meaning lies within that notion. Attachment, association. You are reminding yourself divinity. Your goal, divinity. Day and night, you are reminding yourself divinity, divinity, divinity. That's what you are reminding yourself. That's association. Remember what we talked about civilization earlier? Suppression of the negative, uplifting of the positive. You have to suppress your negative tendencies and you have to uplift your positive. If you are attaching yourself with divine constantly, isn't it a good idea? Isn't that how you can also become something better? Like, forget about religion. I'm preaching Hinduism. Forget about Hinduism. Let's talk about the success story. Like one of the most famous books about success is the book by Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. What is that one idea he tried to put forth? One idea. That you have to make it a burning desire. That you live, breathe. One idea. Something that, let's say, that doesn't exist. But you write it down. You want, let's say, $100 million. And you live it, you breathe it, you sleep it. That's success. You find that path. When there are a couple of ideas, like in that book, there is an idea of mastermind. There are a couple of ideas. Okay, it's not just one idea, but one key idea, one key takeaway from that book. You live it, you breathe it. You make a burning desire. What do you want? You make it your burning desire. Once you make it a burning desire, that you have repeated it so many times in almost all part of your being. This is not like, I'm not talking philosophy here today. I'm not talking religion. I'm talking about a book about success who has nothing to do with Hinduism. Napoleon Hill never ever read Bhagavad Gita. At least that's my understanding. He never read Swami Vivekananda. That's my understanding. Correct me if I am wrong. But the key idea of that book is that once you have such a burning desire, that desire will manifest itself. Now look, this is not about success or failure. What we are observing here is an instance of what? Association. You associate yourself with success, you become a success. You associate yourself with failure, guess what happens? You become a failure. It is an observation of association, which again, very humbly I will put, probably Napoleon Hill doesn't understand himself. He probably doesn't understand these observations because he didn't mention anything about association in his book. And in that very book, he also discussed about a mastermind group. What is a mastermind group? Like, if you are falling behind in any areas of your life, you should be surrounded by a group of people who are actually successful in that particular area. A mastermind group. So all of these ideas are basically an observation of association. When you associate yourself with those ideas over and over and over and over again, you become that idea. Whatever that idea may be, if it is a successful idea, if it's a good idea, you also become good, you also become successful, quote unquote, successful. And if you associate yourself with the bad ideas, you also become a failure. This is what is going on. So when you separated the church and the state, guess what have you done? Not only you have made people much more debauched, much more selfish, much more materialistic. What is a church? A church is a holy place, at the very least. The notion of a church, it is a holy place. It is a place of reverence. It is a place of, attaching yourself to a God, something higher than you. Whatever it is nonetheless a holy place. So when you have separated that holiness, not only that you have made people much more debauched, much more materialistic, guess what else have you done? You have also made people much more Dhamma. Righty? So is secularism a good idea? In my opinion, no. It is not a very good idea. To be honest, these are the reasons as to why I stand firmly against democracy. All the legs of democracy, whether it's free speech, whether it's secularism, whatever it is. I stand firmly against these ideas because of these reasons. Righty? So, when Hindus talked about temples, that these temples will have the holiness, that of course, thanks to the Muslim barbarians who came and destroyed about 40,000 of them, the Muslim barbarians, what they did, not only they slaughtered hundreds of millions of people, guess what else they did? They burned all our libraries, they destroyed the knowledge center of the universe, of the earth, India, and they destroyed about 40,000 of these temples. But that's a different discussion. I might be veering off. Again, there are so many tangents. How many should I talk about? So, this idea of the separation of church and state, when you separated the church and state, guess what have you done? You created a void. And that void will lead to queers for Palestine. Will lead to 5,000 different pronouns. It's not what you were born with. If you're born with a penis, you are a male. If you are born with a vagina, you are a female. That's not the notion. What do you feel at the moment? If you feel like you are a man, you are a man. Doesn't matter what you are born with. If you feel like you are a woman, you are a woman. These kind of absurd ideas, they are coming out of this void. Do you think it is going to create better humanity? Do you honestly believe so? I don't think so. You are entitled to your opinion. Fair enough. Especially if you are talking to, let's say, one of the queers for Palestine. Do you think they will agree with me? No way. That's fine. But I have my own understanding too. My understanding is the separation of church and state. Secularism. It's a faulty notion and it has to go. So we talked about equality. We are looking for a civil war. Practically. Because of democracy. Because of the notion of equality. Cultural communism. Financial communism, the actual communism failed with 100 million dead people as the testament to that failure. That wasn't enough. You had to bring cultural communism. You had to bring cultural communism to prove that, okay, 100 million dead, that's not enough. We need 1 billion people to die. We will see how many has to die this time before the chosen people realizes that they are wrong. So we talked about equality, we talked about secularism, and finally, we're going to talk about free speech. The elephant in the room. That was the discussion of the elephant in the room, right?
I'm not sure if I'm reading you correctly, but these are the kinds of conversations I think we need to have. But on that point, I think I don't want this to be interrogative. And
I just want to interject one
please.
thing, because I think it's important. I think, Jordan, you're very kind, and I understand. I also watched The Message to Muslims, and I thought there were some problems with it, definitely.
Okay.
But when you said there's an elephant in the room that I want to address, my mind immediately went to videos I've seen of you with some of your friends in the street and suggesting violence and suggesting aggressive actions against other communities, which in the West is something that, let's say, in Canada, people don't do that. And that even though there might be civil conflicts, we have a state, we have police, we have an apparatus, which is there to deal, which is not completely perfect, but which functions to install the rules. So when I see someone in the street surrounded by men wearing masks, who are talking about, if these other groups come out, they're going to see us and we're going to be there, and I'm looking for Jews, and we're talking about blood, and there's these very strange behaviors that I think that
when
if you're
did I say
going to...
we're looking for Jews? Do you remember that when I said that exact statement?
I just remember you talking to police about
Jewish people?
Yeah.
I'd like to get an exact quote. Okay, so I don't remember. I recall saying...
Well, the other one, the one that I definitely saw that you spoke for quite a while was relating to some issues with Hindu communities.
So what happened recently? I don't want to go...
well, that's just
No, I think the reason why it's important, the reason why it's important is that I'm a Christian, very much a Christian. I have many problems with modern Western culture, right? But we are in the West, right? And you are in the West.
Yeah, and I am a Westerner.
Right, and you live in the West, and so...
And I'm British.
Yes.
Just like you're Canadian.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And so, to me, the elephant in the room is that's part of the elephant in the room. But there are many people who told Jordan not to come here because of those videos.
Okay, well...
We'll talk about the elephant on the next episode, by the way. I'm just giving you a trailer. Okay. Now, as we are discussing free speech, let's talk about identity first. So what is identity? In my very humble opinion, identity is nothing but a set of beliefs. Then the obvious question is, how many identities can you have? We are talking about free speech. Why people talk about free speech? That you want to identify yourself with certain beliefs, and free speech is a conduit, is a way to express those beliefs. You are identified with something and you want to establish your identity. What are you trying? You are trying to establish your identity. The key word is establishing your identity. That is the notion of free speech. Now, the problem is, what happens when you have to change that identity? See, what is your identity? Your identity is your truth. What you accepted as truth is what you identify with. Depending on what you know, what is your truth? That is your identity. We are talking about evolution. What is evolution? Evolution is nothing but a level of knowledge, a level of truth. Something that you know as true is your level of knowledge, is your level of truth, is your level of evolution. So the question is, when we are discussing free speech, can we have multiple identity? If you know that something is truth, that is your evolution, that is your identity, that is your truth, can you accept something else as true? In other words, you have to evolve. To accept that as true, you have to evolve. Case in point, Islam. Islam has its identity. its identity is what? Is that Quran is the final message of God. It has its level of truth, whatever it is. So now the question is, if you have identity as Islam and that Islam does not want to evolve, what can you do then? Can you actually have free speech and unity? Can you have free speech and unity? Free speech comes with evolution. You cannot have free speech without evolution. Can you? In other words, you are looking at a failure. You cannot have unity. Like, one of the fundamental arguments that comes out of democracy is that we united humanity. Have you? Once again, why have you failed to unite humanity? The reason you failed to unite humanity is because of this problem of identity. The case of Islam, like why Islamic societies are so backward? Because it has its own level of evolution. It cannot accept some other truths. But to establish free speech, what do you have to do? You have to uphold evolution. Because if those beliefs get challenged, you have to change your beliefs, you have to change your identity. So the only way you can establish free speech in the society, if you accept the notion of evolution, if you discard the notion of identity. But that is not your presupposition. What is your presupposition of democracy? The presupposition of democracy is that all the identity will live together. But how will they live together? What is democracy? Democracy is cultural communism. All cultures are equal. Okay. So you already said that identity, all the identities, they are all equal. But they are not equal. There are some identities. Again, what is identity? It's your level of truth. If you have to change that truth based on the current data that you have, based on the available information, you are changing your identity. In other words, when you are saying that, okay, all identities are equal, you are making a logical fallacy. Can you see that fallacy? This is one of the problems of free speech, that if you want to unify humanity, if you want to create a society that is cohesive, you definitely cannot have, either you cannot have identity or you cannot have free speech. Either of these two has to go. Now, the most obvious question is, can you actually give up identity? Because see, whether you like it or not, you will always have some beliefs. Consciously or unconsciously, you will have some beliefs, and those beliefs will shape your identity. Whether you like it or not, you are biologically hardwired to have beliefs. Biologically hardwired. So you cannot just simply say that, okay, I'm going to give up identity. So the most obvious question, or the most difficult question, is that what kind of belief should you choose? What kind of identity should you choose? You should not choose an identity that promotes exclusivity. See, why free speech has failed? Free speech has failed precisely because of the ideologies, because of the identities that promote exclusivity. Islam, for instance. So when you have an identity that promotes exclusivity, that separates you from the rest of the community, guess what that identity is going to do? That identity will eventually destroy free speech in the society. As we are witnessing nowadays, that when democracy was created with an intention that all cultures will live together, but at the end, because those cultures, some of those cultures promote exclusivity, it didn't work out. Precisely for this reason. Like we discussed the flaws of monotheism in one of the previous episodes, okay? And I highly recommend that you watch that episode to understand the full context. So you have to choose an identity, because you will always have some beliefs. You can never shed beliefs entirely. But how are you going to choose that identity? You have to choose that identity that does not have exclusivity. If you have a culture, if you have an identity that promotes exclusivity, then that identity will eventually erode free speech. Okay, so you have no choice but to choose an identity. But the question is, when you will have to choose an identity, you have to choose such an identity that does not promote exclusivity, that promotes inclusivity, that promotes pluralism. In other words, that promotes polytheism. Without this notion being implemented, unfortunately, free speech will die today or tomorrow. Okay? See, I am not against the idea of free speech. Free speech is essential. But what I am against, though, is the notion of equality, because equality is rooted, it originated in democracy. Democracy means all cultures are equal. Democracy implies equality. And when you think about evolution, what is evolution? It goes diametrically opposite of equality. Evolution means inequality. So which one should you choose as a model for civilization? You have to choose inequality. You have to choose evolution. As long as you support equality, you are going against evolution. But to uphold civilization, you must accept the notion of evolution. And this is precisely the reason why I am fundamentally opposed to the idea of democracy, because democracy cannot uphold evolution. Democracy is about equality, and equality goes against civilization. Equality goes against evolution. This is why you have to give up the notion of democracy to uphold free speech. Now, let me give you a couple of these examples that what free speech can do. What free speech can do if you do not have an identity that is inclusive, then how free speech is going to affect you. Let me give you a couple of examples. So what is free speech? Free speech is a weapon. Remember, we talked about freedom in one of the earlier episodes. Freedom and free speech, these are not the same thing. They are very, 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 very different things. Again, this is a mental substitution. Dr. Danial Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. What is this mental substitution? You are substituting freedom with free speech. What is free speech? Let me give you a couple of examples. First one obviously is Gaza. A phony bullshit sob story. A phony victimhood bullshit sob story. That's what free speech is. People are saying today that, oh, Israel is an illegitimate country. Does Israel have a right to exist? That is the question being asked. What if I tell you, does Pakistan has a right to exist? Not just Pakistan, 57 Muslim countries. Do any of these countries have a right to exist? What is the history of Islam? Savagery and barbarism. Everywhere they went, everywhere, the indigenous people have been slaughtered en masse. En masse. Everyone, men, women, and children irrespective. Whether it's North Africa, whether it's Middle East, of course, whether it's India. Like we talked about in an earlier episode, like first of all, after Muhammad's death, for about 200 years, there is no history. There is a vacuum. Why? Why there is a vacuum? Because people didn't want to write about these things. We have the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, the highest commentator of Islam, 700 years later. Why? No one was there before 700 years. Of course, there were a lot of people. But those history have been whitewashed, have been purged. That history have been purged. In about less than 50 years' time, like there was this Rashidun Caliphate and of course Umayyad Caliphate, the two successive caliphates. You had the landmass, like I believe it was Rashidun Caliphate, the size of the United States. Then you had Umayyad Caliphate, I believe, as big as Russia. As big as Russia. That is the vast swath of land that these people controlled. How? And within the speed, you can control a land, but the speed they conquered this land, the sheer brutality. I think it was Dr. Peterson himself. It wasn't you, Dr. Peterson. You said that the Persian history, I will try to find that video. I remember like you made, I remember like you said that Muhammad was a warlord. That warlord comment like a long time ago. That Persian history, that you don't have any evidence, that the destruction was so vast, you don't even have an evidence. Even today, like with modern technology, you cannot find any evidence. That was your comment, Mr. Peterson. Not my comment. That was your comment. If I remember properly. What happened to the Persians? Like Persian or like, again, I will try to find that video. Okay. That the destruction in the Byzantine or something. That the destruction was so brutal that even today you cannot find any evidence. That was your comment. Okay.
There's a couple of things that I can't wrap my head around easily in relationship to Islam. And so one is what I see as the failure to separate church from state. And that's a problem. Now, it may not be a problem as such, but it's certainly a problem in relationship to the relation between Islam and the West, because we separate church from state. Now, there's fundamentalists in the United States, Christian fundamentalists, who think that that separation is a mistake. So it's not only an idea that's rooted in Islam that those should be united. But it's definitely a problem with regards to our coexistence, because that's a fundamentally different presumption. Okay, so that's problem number one. Problem number two, for me, and again, this may be a consequence of my ignorance, which I'm trying to rectify, Muhammad was a warlord. And I don't know what to do about that fact. Like, one thing you can say about Christ, hypothetically, let's say, I'm not talking about a historical reality necessarily, although I'm not denying it either, is that of all the things he was, warlord was definitely not one of them. And I don't know what to do about that. And so I don't know how to reconcile that. And I don't know how to reconcile, like, not only was Muhammad a warlord, which I don't think is an unreasonable thing to proclaim, the expansion that he initiated was unbelievably successful. I mean, within 600 years, it was the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And it demolished Byzantine Christianity, which is something that Western people don't even know. You know, I've read thinkers who said that the West was so traumatized, culturally, let's say, by the demolition of Byzantine Christianity, that we can't even study it now. And so, I don't know if that's true, but I don't know that it's not true either. And the Buddhists were wiped out of Afghanistan, and we saw that echoed in the Taliban's destruction of those great Buddhist monuments. And so what I'm hoping is that there's a bridge. There better be a bridge. And that's why I want to have these discussions, because I'd like to understand if there's a bridge. And so lots of people have sent me people who I should talk to, who they think represent Islam far better than Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And perhaps they're correct, and hopefully I'll get an opportunity to talk to them, because I would like to know if what I think is wrong. Because if it's wrong, it's important that I know it's wrong. But at the moment, I don't A, I don't know it's wrong, and B, I don't see I'm not sure what it signifies. So, and I don't think anyone is sure, right? Because we have this entangling of the civilizations. You know, and there's other things too, like I'm not very happy with the Saudi Arabs and the Wahhabis. I don't think they're our allies. I don't see how any Western woman can possibly think that they're our allies. And I'm not happy with the fact that the petrodollars that we send them are transformed in substantial part into the kind of propaganda that's definitely a threat to the West. And I'm not very happy with the fact that our politicians appear stupidly blind to that. Now, that may again be a consequence of my ignorance. It's certainly possible. But those are the sorts of things that I can't reconcile. And so, you know, I've also seen parallels between the ideas that I'm presenting here and other religious traditions, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism. It's harder for me to bridge the gap with Islam, and I'm not sure why that is. I think it has something to do with the things that I just laid out.
So what is free speech? No one is asking today whether these 57 countries have a right to exist. They have a phony, victimhood bullshit sob story, the story of Gaza. That is how the whole world is now chanting, praising, mourning the death of the terrorist. What is the Gaza story? Let's assume that you live in a house. A bunch of savages come to your house. Look, I didn't really want to mean it, okay? I just have to make this example a little bit more graphic. I don't mean any disrespect. A bunch of savages come to your house, kick you out of your house. Kick you out of your house. They do the most egregious, the most depraved thing human beings can imagine to your family. Some of your grandchildren, they fortunately escaped this tyranny. Centuries after centuries of exile, because they have an emotional connection. This is where my grandfather used to live. Because they have an emotional connection to that land, centuries after centuries of exile, they come back to that land. Finding that land abandoned, they purchase the land. They purchase the land and build a house in your memory, in the memory of their grandfather, of their ancestors. That's the story of Israel, as far as I am concerned. It was a purchased land. After centuries of exile, this land was abandoned by both the Britishers and the Ottomans and purchased by the Zionists. And then they build Israel. And whom does this land belong to? Muslims. You see the logic. When that land, this Gaza, was under the Egyptian rule, there was no Palestine cause. Like I believe it was when late 60s or 50s or something. Again, please do not quote me on the dates. But when it was under the Egyptian rule, there was no Palestinian cause. As soon as it came under the governance of Israel, well, now you have a Palestinian cause. It was a phony victimhood bullshit story created by a terrorist called Yasser Arafat, and now people are dying, people are chanting all over the world. Kashmir, the name came out of Rishi Kashyap. This Kashmir Valley, it was the seat of civilization. About 1 million Kashmiri Pandits have been driven out of their homeland. Many have been butchered. And now, whom does this land belong to? Muslims. No one is questioning whether these 57 countries, whether Pakistan is a legitimate country, whether Afghanistan is a legitimate country, no one is asking that question. The only question the whole world is asking, whether Israel is a legitimate country. That's the gist of free speech. It's a weapon. Mr. António Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, when those savages of Hezbollah were targeted by a very sophisticated pager attack, like these are devices that are supposed to be carried by the terrorist. This is not a mobile device that everyone will carry one of these. That is definitely not the case. These pages, who owns these pages? The terrorist. These are savages. These are savages of Hezbollah. When they were targeted in such a sophisticated operation by IDF, the Secretary General of United Nations, no less, he is the one taking to the Twitter and telling the whole world, I am alarmed. Right after Israel suffered the deadliest terror attacks, he told it to the United Nations in the General Assembly. It was not a Twitter message. It was not a Twitter message. He himself spoke about it in General Assembly. October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. His words. Like he spoke these words. This is free speech.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing. But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people.
In Bangladesh right now, hundreds of people, hundreds of Hindus have been butchered, lynched in many cases, lynched. God knows how many temples have been destroyed. God knows how many women have been raped, abducted, forcefully converted. Not a single word of condemnation came out of this. I don't want to call names, but this bastard, this SOB, not a single word of condemnation came out of this bastard, this fat fucker. Not a single word of condemnation. That's free speech. It's a weapon. It's a tool to brainwash gullible people. Let's talk about Zakir Naik. Free speech, his free speech. What is Islam in essence? A lie.
The question posed was, if Islam is a religion of peace, how come it was spread by the sword? Islam comes from the root word salam, which means peace. It also means submitting our will to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Almighty God. In short, Islam means peace acquired by submitting our will to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But as I mentioned earlier, that everyone in the world does not want peace to prevail in the world. There are certain anti-social elements for their own benefits. They don't want peace to prevail. The robbers, the criminal. If peace will prevail, they will go out of business. So for their own benefit, there are certain human beings who don't want peace to prevail. So for such types of people, force may have to be used. Therefore, we have police, etc. So Islam is for peace, but sometimes you may have to use force to put the anti-social elements in their place. And the best answer to this question, that Islam was spread by the sword, is given by Deleuze O'Leary. He's a non-Muslim historian of great repute. In his book, Islam at the Crossroad, on page number 80, says that history makes it clear that the legend of fanatical Muslims sweeping across the world, forcing Islam at the point of the sword over conquered races, is the most fantastic, absurd myth that historians have ever repeated. Delesi O'Leary.
And how did that lie grow all over the hundreds of years? Because of the left-wing historians. I didn't know what Muhammad did when he went to Mecca. Like when he migrated to Medina from Mecca, that he was a troublemaker in the first place. In Mecca, he used to insult the gods and goddesses, the 360 idols in Kaaba. He used to call the names of those idols standing in Kaaba, in front of the Kaaba. He was a troublemaker, that's why he was kicked out. He migrated because he was persecuted. That was the story. That's free speech, a lie. We didn't know about it. Why? Because the leftist historians, they whitewashed this history. I didn't know that 40,000 temples have been destroyed in Bharat. I didn't know hundreds of millions of people, innocent people, have been butchered in history's most notorious and gruesome execution in Bharat, in India. I didn't know that Britishers looted some $43 trillion up until very recently. That's free speech. Remember the book that I just mentioned, Napoleon Hill, Thinking Fast and Slow? Napoleon Hill, not anyone else, not Zakir Naik. Napoleon Hill. We are talking about elephant in the room. Again, we'll talk about elephant in the room on the next episode, by the way. There was an example. Remember the analogy that I just gave you? Burning desire? Do you know what was the example he put forth? Example of a terrorist. What was his name? Zaid ibn Thabit or whatever. When that terrorist went into Spain, his name is probably Zaid bin Thabit or something. I cannot remember exactly. Okay, apologies. When that savage went to Spain to loot that country, guess what he did? He burned the ships. You cannot have a retreat. That was the idea. Like when you are embarking on a journey, when you have this burning desire, allow yourself no retreat. That was the philosophy. That was the idea. And how is he demonstrating this idea? Putting an example of a terrorist. Can you believe? It was that guy. Later on, much later on, I found out, oh, come on, this is the guy. He was a terrorist who went to loot Spain. So he told like his holy warriors, a bunch of degenerate savages, you see that the ships have been burned. The only way we can escape out of this island if we win. Allow yourself no retreat. It's a good idea, it's a great idea, but what was the reason that he had to choose this example? What was the reasoning behind? In that book, by the way, in that book, he brought up the notion of Umar. I'm talking about the second, so it was Abu Bakr, Umar, the second Rashidun Caliph, second, like after Abu Bakr, Umar was the Caliph, the second Caliph. So he brought up the notion of crusade, that when the Crusaders invaded Jerusalem, it was a bloodbath. And when the Muslims went there, what happened? oh, it was all pissy, pissy, huggy, huggy. It was all kissy, kissy. And it was, kumbaya. It was all kumbaya. It was all hallelujah. You see what free speech is? Or you still can't see it? That's your free speech. For the sake of humanity, if you cannot get rid of this free speech, it is going to end up only in bloodshed. It will only end up in a phony victimhood bullshit sob story for which hundreds of millions of people will die for no reason. And in the next episode and the final episode of this talk, we'll talk about the elephant in the room. Until next time, thank you for joining and have a great day. Bye for now.